Labor Day, September 4th, 1911. Comiskey Park, Chicago. The ring sits between the pitcher's mound and second base at the city's newest baseball stadium, barely 1 year old, and somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 people have packed the grandstands in the September heat to watch the two best wrestlers alive settle an argument that started 3 years earlier in this same city. The gate receipts come in at roughly $87,000, a record for any wrestling event ever staged. George Hackenschmidt, the undisputed world heavyweight wrestling champion, walks to the ring wearing full-length tights. He had never worn full-length tights in competition before. Underneath them, his knee is wrapped in what ringside reporters described as 20 yards of rubber bandaging, with ordinary bandages running up his ankle and leg. The promoter who organized this match, Jack Curley, had admitted days earlier that Hackenschmidt's ankle was bad, too bad to wrestle. He said they were in so deep financially that postponement wasn't possible. Frank Gotch, the challenger, weighs 204 pounds on match day. He is 33 years old, born in Humboldt, Iowa, and has held exactly one championship ambition since the day he took up wrestling: beat Hackenschmidt again, permanently, and close the argument. The match lasts roughly 25 minutes. Hackenschmidt loses both falls. When Gotch cinches his signature toe hold in the second fall, Hackenschmidt cries out, "Don't break my foot!" Referee Ed Smith waves the match over. The Hackenschmidt-Gotch rivalry didn't just end one man's career. It ended legitimate professional wrestling in America and forced the sport toward the staged spectacle it has been ever since. The question worth asking, the one that still divides wrestling historians, is exactly how much of what happened was an accident. George Hackenschmidt was born on August 1st, 1877 in Dorpat, Livonia, now Tartu, Estonia, then part of the Russian Empire. He became known as the Russian Lion, a nickname earned during his London years that followed him everywhere. By the time most Americans had heard of him, the title had become inseparable from the man. Billed at 5 feet 9 inches and 220 pounds, with a 52-inch chest and a 20-inch neck, he was the physical culture press's favorite exhibit, proof that a human body could become something extraordinary through will and method. His record before Gotch wasn't merely good, it was almost alien in its consistency. He won nearly 300 consecutive Greco-Roman matches. He won all 16 bouts in the Paris World Championship tournament. He took both the Moscow and St. Petersburg championships in a 1900 tournament. When he arrived in North America in 1905, he was already the most famous athlete in the world in any sport. On May 4th, 1905, at Madison Square Garden in New York, he defeated American heavyweight champion Tom Jenkins in 2 straight falls, the first in 31 minutes 14 seconds, the second in 22 minutes 4 seconds, to become wrestling's first undisputed world heavyweight champion. The New York Times ran it on the front page. He held that title, undefeated, for almost exactly 3 years. Nobody came close. His style made him uniquely dangerous. He came from Greco-Roman competition, where his upper body strength gave him an almost unfair advantage in the bear hug, a technique he is credited with professionalizing. But he'd been competing in catch-as-catch-can matches since his English tours in 1903, sometimes wrestling 5 opponents in a single evening at music hall venues. He beat everyone. Then, Frank Gotch asked him to come to Chicago. Frank Alvin Gotch was born on a farm 3 miles south of Humboldt, Iowa, on April 27, 1877. He didn't have a training laboratory in St. Petersburg or a patron in the Russian imperial court. He had farm chores and Farmer Burns. Martin Farmer Burns was the most accomplished catch wrestling teacher in America, a former world champion so physically dense that he once survived a 6-foot hanging without injury, his neck alone preventing the drop from killing him. Burns watched Gotch lose an exhibition against American champion Dan McLeod in 1899 and thought the kid was worth developing. He offered to train him. Gotch accepted, and under Burns, he became something that Hackenschmidt's European education hadn't quite prepared for. Catch-as-catch-can was a different game from Greco-Roman. Leg holds, ankle locks, toe holds, all legal. The goal was submission or pin by any hold you could apply below the waist as well as above. Gotch built his entire game around the toe hold, grab the opponent's ankle, fold the leg at an angle, apply rotational pressure until the knee or ankle gives or the opponent quits. He drilled it for thousands of hours. Every match he finished by finding the toehold. The documentary record of Gotch's career makes something else equally clear. He was genuinely skilled. He was also genuinely ruthless. When Lou Thesz began his own wrestling career in the early 1930s, he made a point of talking to older men who had known Gotch personally. The portrait Thesz assembled from those conversations was consistent. Gotch was a man who succeeded at his business primarily because he was, for lack of a kinder description, a dirty wrestler. That's not to say that he wasn't competent, because everyone I ever talked with said he was one of the best. But those same people described him as someone who delighted in hurting or torturing lesser opponents, even when they were supposed to be working out, and he was always looking for an illegal edge when he was matched against worthy ones. Charlie Cutler, who eventually succeeded Gotch as world champion and knew him well, told Thesz that Gotch would check the oil, pull hair, and even break a bone to get an advantage in a contest, and he was unusually careful to have the referee in his pocket too, in case all else failed. The era's ethics weren't Hackenschmidt's ethics. Catch wrestling in the American Midwest was rougher and less sentimental about sportsmanship than the European tradition that had shaped the Russian Lion. Gotch was a product of that system, shaped by it from his first organized match in 1899. He didn't invent the dirty tactics. He was just more willing to use them, and more inventive in their application, than anyone who'd come before. The first match between them was April 3, 1908, at Dexter Park Pavilion on Chicago's southwest side, a shed-like structure seating roughly 10,000 fans, packed full for a match the souvenir program billed as the athletic contest of the century. The two men stood roughly the same age, born a year apart, but couldn't have presented more differently. Hackenschmidt stripped to the waist to the sound of audience appreciation. Gotch wore full-length tights and carried what reporters described as an unsettling purposefulness. By most accounts, Hackenschmidt came in underprepared. He hadn't trained publicly in Chicago as planned. He'd spent his days walking along Lake Michigan. Against Gotch, stamina would matter in a way it never had against any European opponent. For 2 hours they wrestled. Gotch refused to engage the bear hug and instead used speed and sustained pressure to wear the champion down. Ringside reporters from the Chicago Tribune, the Buffalo Express, and the Minneapolis Tribune all documented the same problem emerging after the first hour. Gotch was covered in oil. Hackenschmidt couldn't get a grip. He complained to referee Ed Smith, who told him he should have noticed the oil before the match started. Then Gotch went further. Tribune reporter George Seiler, writing from the ringside media seat, noted the Americans' rough work, principally thumbing of the eyes, and heard the audience hissing at Gotch. Horace Lurch of the Buffalo Express wrote that Gotch never lost an opportunity to work his fingers and thumbs somewhere in the vicinity of Hack's optics. Smith walked past all of it. At the 2-hour mark, trapped against the ropes, Hackenschmidt finally went down. He held off the toe hold, drilled for, anticipated, but holding it off cost the last of his strength. He said, "I surrender the championship of the world to Mr. Gotch." He stood, shook Gotch's hand, went to his dressing room, and refused to come back for the second fall. Immediately after, Hackenschmidt was gracious. "He is the king of the class," he said. "After going nearly 2 hours with him, my muscles became stale. My feet also gave out." Only after returning to Europe did his account change, when he told the London press about the oil and the dirty tactics. Defeated champions have motives to reinterpret their losses. That is simply true. But the reporters at Dexter Park that night had no stake in a rematch. Their accounts of the oil and the thumbing were filed under deadline and matched each other. The rematch promoters tightened the rules for 1911 anyway. Bare-chested wrestling. No oils or lotions. The contract explicitly addressed the complaints from 1908. Hackenschmidt arrived in Chicago the first week of August 1911 to prepare. His knee problems weren't a secret. Australian newspapers had reported he required knee surgery in 1906. He'd needed rehabilitation in 1907 after knee pain interrupted his European preparations. His knees had been a documented vulnerability for 5 years by the time he set foot in Chicago. One of the men in his training camp that August was a wrestler working under his real name, Adolf Ernst. known in the ring world as Ad Santel. His presence in Hackenschmidt's camp was documented in newspaper reports from the months before the fight. He served as head trainer and primary sparring partner. Approximately 5 days before the September 4th match, Hackenschmidt sustained a serious knee injury in training. Both he and his final sparring partner, Dr. Benjamin Roller, described what happened the same way. Roller, trying to hold Hackenschmidt down in the bottom position, caught his right foot against Hackenschmidt's right knee. Accidental. Roller didn't think it was serious. Referee Ed Smith, informed of it, dismissed it as inconsequential. This is where the historical record fractures. Decades after the match, a story circulated that Santel had confessed to Lou Thez that Gotch's backers paid him $5,000 to injure Hackenschmidt in training and make it look like an accident. This account eventually appeared in a 1998 A&E television documentary. Santel had died in 1966. His alleged confession was secondhand. Santel to Thez, Thez to a wrestling historian, then into the public record through a television program broadcast 87 years after the event. And critically, Hackenschmidt's own published account of the training camp injury doesn't name Santel at all. Neither does Roller's. According to Hackenschmidt's writings, his sparring partners for the 1911 preparation were Americus, Jacobus Cook, Vladek Zabisco, and Dr. Roller. Multiple serious wrestling historians have explicitly called the Santel story a false rumor that gained momentum and was taken as truth by many. The conspiracy required a saboteur who neither the victim nor the named perpetrator ever mentioned. That is an evidentiary problem that doesn't go away. What is documented is both simpler and nearly as damning. Hackenschmidt had a pre-existing knee condition known to anyone paying attention. He sustained an injury 5 days before a match with a contractual obligation he couldn't escape without forfeiting enormous sums. Promoter Curley knew. He said so. He decided the gate revenue outweighed his fighter's physical safety and forced the match forward. Gotch's team knew. It was impossible to miss. When the match started, Gotch found the knee almost immediately. The match itself wasn't a wrestling contest. A 1914 contemporary source with specific timing records places the first fall at approximately 5 minutes and 32 seconds. Gotch grabbing the foot almost from the opening, Hackenschmidt crying out in pain, Gotch transitioning to a crotch hold for the pin. Other secondary sources place the first fall closer to 14 minutes. The records conflict on timing. They agree completely on the outcome. Both falls lost in well under 30 minutes. The 1908 match had lasted over 2 hours. In his own later writings, Hackenschmidt described his condition. I couldn't put my left knee on the ground or even bend it, and my left foot was worse than useless because every lateral movement gave me intense pain. He said he had told no one before the match because he feared the financial consequences of withdrawal. The first time Gotch applied pressure to the foot in the opening minutes, Hackenschmidt screamed. The foul play allegations didn't stop at the knee. Hackenschmidt wrote that during the match, Gotch engaged in eye gouging, ear pulling, and face scratching. He called it not a wrestling match, but a butchery match. He complained to Smith during the contest. Smith didn't stop it. Smith did say afterward that he had witnessed needless acts of absolute cruelty from Gotch that he didn't like, and that the really courageous man is willing to let up on a beaten foe and not punish needlessly or wantonly. The referee's own post-match statement partially corroborated the allegation without ruling on it formally. Contemporary Chicago press noted that Chicago police halted ringside betting before the match began, a detail suggesting the result was considered a foregone conclusion in certain circles. The audience that filled Comiskey Park for the biggest wrestling gate in history left, by contemporary accounts, disgusted. They'd paid for a championship. They watched a broken man taken apart by someone who knew exactly where he was broken. In the second fall, Gotch applied his toe hold to the already damaged foot. Hackenschmidt said, "Don't break my foot." He submitted. The match was over. George Hackenschmidt was 33 years old. He returned to England, consulted on his knee, found the damage severe enough that even training was excruciating, and decided he was done. He never competed in a professional wrestling match again. In the months following September 4th, he made some theatrical appearances. A February 1912 show at Chicago's Globe Theater, former world champion on a stage rather than a mat. But his competitive career ended at Comiskey Park. When pain prevented even the first workouts for a planned Zbyszko match the following year, Hackenschmidt chose philosophy over another surgery. He spent the next 57 years writing books, lecturing at universities, and developing a systematic philosophy of physical culture and the human body. He died in London on February 19, 1968, aged 90. Frank Gotch held the world title until April 1, 1913, retiring in Kansas City after defeating George Lurich. His reign from 1908 to 1913 was one of the 10 longest in professional wrestling's history. Almost immediately after September 1911, however, the serious competition dried up. He announced retirement multiple times, came back for paydays, turned down a match against Ad Santel in San Francisco, and eventually joined the Sells Floto Circus, offering $250 to any man who could last 15 minutes with him without being pinned or submitting. Nobody ever collected. He moved home to Humboldt and died there on December 17, 1917, of uremic poisoning, aged 40. His world had ended before he did. With both men gone, the World Heavyweight Championship entered years of genuine institutional confusion. Rival claims, regional recognitions, names unfamiliar to anyone outside wrestling scholarship. Joe Stecher eventually became the first widely recognized champion after Gotch's retirement, winning his title in 1915. But the sport had already begun to understand something that would take another decade to fully institutionalize. A championship wrestling match requires a credible champion. A credible champion requires credible challengers. With Hackenschmidt retired and Gotch gone within 2 years of each other, professional wrestling had no answer for the central question of who was actually the best in the world. And that uncertainty created an opening. By the early 1920s, the Gold Dust Trio had stepped into it. Ed Strangler Lewis was the champion. Billy Sandow was the business mind. Toots Mondt was the innovator and booker. Between them, they built a specific system. Predetermined outcomes, touring circuits, managed results. Lewis drew crowds with his headlock, made famous as a crowd attraction rather than a functional finish. The matches were, as one historical account states directly, said to be honest, but were predetermined. It was a scam. The trio didn't invent corruption in professional wrestling. Side bets and promoter manipulation had been undermining the sport since the 1870s. But they were the first to make the worked match the institutional default, to take what had been an occasional corruption and build it into a business model systematic enough to spread across the country. They formalized what had been informal, and the sport never recovered its previous identity. The connection between September 4th, 1911, and the Gold Dust Trio of the early 1920s isn't a clean causal line. No single night killed legitimate wrestling, but that night removed the two men whose rivalry had made legitimate championship wrestling a national event worth 30,000 seats, worth $87,000 at the gate, worth front-page coverage in every major American newspaper. When both Hackenschmidt and Gotch were gone, there was nobody left who could make audiences believe the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The vacuum the Gold Dust Trio filled, between them, Hackenschmidt and Gotch had created. The prosecutorial case against what happened at Comiskey Park rests on verified facts, not on the contested Santel allegation. Hackenschmidt entered the ring with a documented, visible knee injury. His promoter knew and chose revenue over the fighter's safety. Gotch's team knew it couldn't be missed. Gotch targeted that knee from the opening seconds. He then added the eye gouging and face scratching that his own referee partially acknowledged after the fact. The match ended in 25 minutes when the 1908 match had lasted 2.5 hours. What the evidence doesn't support is the premeditated sabotage narrative, Gotch engineering the pre-match injury through a planted agent, paying $5,000 to make it happen. That story traveled from Santel to Thez to a historian to a 1998 television documentary. Neither Hackenschmidt nor Roller ever named Santel. Most serious historians treat it as a rumor, given the weight of fact through repetition. The cleaner truth is, in some ways, worse. Nobody needed to engineer anything. The knee was already compromised. The promoter knew. The machine had its own financial momentum. Gotch walked into that ring knowing exactly what he was going to find, and he found it within the first few minutes. George Hackenschmidt walked into Chicago a wrestling champion and walked out a philosopher. Frank Gotch walked into Chicago a champion and walked out a millionaire who never wrestled a serious match again. The sport itself changed in that ring on September 4th, 1911. Not because one man's knee gave out, but because the people responsible for that match chose to proceed anyway, and the last credible world championship of professional wrestling's legitimate era ended in a 25-minute exhibition against an injured man. What has been performed under the same name ever since has been something else. Subscribe for more stories like this.